Ticket, please. The words dripped with ice. Jamal, 12, swallowed hard, handing it over. He knew the drill. It was always the double take, the squint. Catherine Brady held it up to the light like it was a counterfeit 20. What she didn't know, what fueled the quiet fire in Jamal's eyes, was that the suit wasn't just fancy. It was armor, forged by a father who'd faced 1,000 such moments. They thought they were dealing with a kid playing dress-up. Oh, they had no idea. They were about to learn how quiet kindness, backed by a titan's resolve, could turn their little game upside down. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about to become a whole new flight plan. Ticket, please. The words dripped with ice. Jamal, 12, swallowed hard, handing it over. He knew the drill. It was always the double take, the squint. Catherine Brady held it up to the light like it was a counterfeit 20. What she didn't know, what fueled the quiet fire in Jamal's eyes, was that the suit wasn't just fancy. It was armor, forged by a father who'd faced 1,000 such moments. They thought they were dealing with a kid playing dress-up. Oh, they had no idea. They were about to learn how quiet kindness, backed by a titan's resolve, could turn their little game upside down. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about to become a whole new flight plan. The boardroom held its breath. Catherine Brady, a woman whose smile could sell snow to an Eskimo, stood frozen. The click of her Italian heels, usually a declaration of confidence, now echoed like a death knell in the vast space. The smile, however, was gone, replaced by something akin to dawning horror. She'd walked in ready to close the deal, present the quarterly report, charm the room. Instead, she found him, 12-year-old Jamal Washington, seated beside Elijah Washington, his father. Not just any passenger, not just some kid in a fancy suit, but the very CEO whose company she'd been trying to impress, whose handshake could make or break her career. Elijah's gaze, sharp and unwavering, pinned her in place. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then Elijah's voice, calm yet laced with an unmistakable steel, cut through it. "Miss Brady," he began, the name hanging in the air like a challenge. "You remember my son, don't you?" Nervous glances shot around the mahogany table. Executives, usually masters of composure, shifted uncomfortably. Catherine swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. The realization crashed over her. The boy she had dismissed, humiliated, in first class just days ago, held her fate in his small hands. And his father, the man she was now failing to impress, was about to wield that power. But to understand the weight of that moment, we must rewind 3 days. 3 days earlier, anticipation vibrated around Jamal Washington like a palpable force field. He stood before his full-length mirror, meticulously adjusting the knot of his silk tie. The tailored navy suit, a miniature replica of his father's power suit, fit him perfectly. It wasn't just clothing. It was a statement. Today was the day. His first solo flight, Atlanta to New York, for the Young Entrepreneurs Conference. A knock on the door. Elijah Washington leaned against the frame, a complex mix of pride and concern etched on his face. "Are you sure about the suit, son? You might be more comfortable in something casual." Jamal straightened his tie, his expression firm. "Dad, I'm representing Washington Enterprises. First impressions matter. You taught me that." Elijah nodded, unable to argue with his own wisdom, perfectly mirrored in his son. At 42, he'd built Washington Enterprises from a tiny tech startup into a multi-billion-dollar powerhouse, shattering glass ceilings and defying expectations. He'd poured his knowledge, his experience, into Jamal, nurturing his innate business acumen. Jamal's passion had ignited early. While other kids sold lemonade, he'd launched a neighborhood delivery service, coordinating bicycle-powered grocery runs for elderly residents. By 9, he was dabbling in app development. Now at 12, he had created Equal Space, a platform to connect minority-owned businesses with investors, garnering the attention of the conference organizers. "I still think I should come with you," Elijah said, helping Jamal close his suitcase. "Dad, I'll be fine. Aunt Vanessa is meeting me at JFK. Besides, you have that meeting in London tomorrow," Jamal insisted. Elijah hesitated, then relented. "All right, but you call me when you land, and again before you go to sleep. And if anything unusual happens, Jamal grinned, completing the ritual. I know, Dad. Code red. The drive to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was a symphony of repeated instructions and reminders. Elijah's anxiety, Jamal understood, stemmed from love and from experience. He knew the world could be harsh, even for a privileged young black man like Jamal. At the security checkpoint, Elijah knelt, straightening Jamal's already impeccable tie. Remember what I always tell you, he said, his voice low. I have to work twice as hard to get half the respect. Jamal echoed the mantra. I know, Dad. Elijah's eyes softened. I'm proud of you, son. So proud. He pulled Jamal into a tight embrace before releasing him into the churning current of the airport. Walking through security, Jamal felt the weight of his father's expectations, the heft of his own ambition. He turned to wave, his small figure momentarily seeming vulnerable in the vast terminal, but his posture remained unwavering. As he navigated toward his gate, he registered the curious glances, the raised eyebrows. A 12-year-old in a power suit wasn't an everyday sight, but there was something else in those looks, a subtle shift in expression that Jamal had learned to recognize. The quick assessment, the almost imperceptible narrowing of eyes, the whispers masked by coughs. He straightened his shoulders, refusing to shrink, and continued his march. At the gate, a Skyline Airlines attendant announced boarding for first-class passengers. Jamal stepped forward, boarding pass in hand. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with a tight, professionally manufactured smile, scrutinized the ticket, her gaze lingering for what felt like an eternity before reluctantly waving him through. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, Jamal caught the eye of a flight attendant, Catherine Brady. Her fleeting glance held a dismissive indifference before she turned to greet an elderly white couple behind him with excessive warmth. A small thing, barely perceptible to most, but Jamal felt it like a pinprick. He didn't know then, this seemingly insignificant interaction, that it was just the beginning of a journey that would test him in ways he could never have imagined. He found his seat, 3A, a window seat in the first-class cabin. He carefully stowed his backpack, mindful not to crease his suit, and settled in. Around him, business executives tapped away at laptops and scrolled through smartphones. A few glanced up as he took his seat, their expressions ranging from mild surprise to outright discomfort. The man in 3B, a white-haired gentleman in his 60s wearing a golf shirt emblazoned with a country club logo, visibly recoiled as Jamal sat down. A name tag pinned to his shirt identified him as Benjamin Reynolds. "Excuse me, young man," Reynolds said, his voice carrying with a calculated precision. "I believe first class is boarding now. This section requires a special ticket." Jamal smiled politely. "Yes, sir, I have a first-class ticket." He retrieved his boarding pass, displaying it for Reynolds, though he knew he wasn't obligated to. Reynolds scowled, examining the ticket with a dismissive flick of the wrist. "Standards are certainly slipping these days," he muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear. Jamal pretended to adjust his seatbelt, the heat rising to his cheeks. His father had prepared him for moments like this, but knowing and experiencing were two different beasts. Catherine Brady, the flight attendant from the jet bridge, approached their row, her smile radiant as she addressed Reynolds. "Can I get you a pre-departure beverage, sir?" "Scotch, neat," Reynolds replied. Catherine nodded, then glanced past Jamal, addressing the passenger in the aisle seat. The businesswoman requested water and received a warm, "Certainly, ma'am." Jamal waited patiently, but Catherine turned to leave without acknowledging him. "Excuse me," Jamal said politely. "Could I have an apple juice, please?" Catherine paused, turning back with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll need to see your boarding pass again," she said, the words laced with suspicion. Jamal retrieved his ticket for the second time. Catherine examined it with exaggerated thoroughness. "This doesn't look right," she said, her voice carrying in the suddenly hushed cabin. "Let me double-check this with the gate." "Is there a problem?" a soft voice inquired. Another flight attendant, Linda Chen, had approached, her name tag gleaming under the soft cabin light. "Just verifying this young man's seating assignment," Catherine replied stiffly, her gaze fixed on Jamal. Linda glanced at the boarding pass. "Everything looks in order to me," she said, her tone professional, but her meaning clear. She turned to Jamal, offering a genuine smile. "I'll get your apple juice." Catherine's lips thinned, but she moved on to the next row without further comment. As more passengers boarded, Jamal noticed a pattern. Catherine greeted white passengers with effusive warmth, barely acknowledging others. When Linda brought his apple juice, she placed it on his tray table with a kind wink. "That's a very nice suit," she commented, her voice low. "Are you traveling for business?" Before Jamal could answer, Reynolds interjected. "Probably his first time on an airplane. Skyline must be giving away first-class tickets as some kind of diversity promotion." Linda's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Sir, all our passengers deserve respect." "I'm attending the Young Entrepreneurs Conference in New York," Jamal answered, his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. "I'm presenting my new app." Reynolds raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, turning his attention to his drink. As the final boarding announcements were made, Jamal felt increasingly isolated. He tried to focus on his presentation notes, but it was difficult to concentrate with the weight of disapproving glances and whispered comments pressing down on him. When the plane began taxiing, Jamal gazed out the window, watching Atlanta shrink beneath him. He thought of his father's words, "I have to work twice as hard to get half the respect." Right now, he would settle for just being treated like any other passenger. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and Catherine began the in-flight service. She moved methodically through the cabin, attending to each passenger with practiced efficiency, until she reached Jamal's row. "I believe this young man might be in the wrong seat," she said, her voice loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. Reynolds nodded knowingly, fueling the drama. Jamal's hands clenched in his lap. "My seat is 3A, he said clearly, as shown on my boarding pass. Catherine's smile remained fixed and artificial. "Well, sometimes these things happen. Computers make mistakes." Passengers were beginning to stare, whispering amongst themselves. Jamal felt his throat tighten, but he remembered his father's advice. "Never let them see you sweat." "I assure you," he said, the calm he feigned, "I'm in the correct seat." Linda Chen passed by at that moment, her eyes scanning the situation. Sensing the tension, she paused. "Is everything all right here?" "Just fine," Catherine replied too quickly, her tone tight. "Just making sure everyone is where they belong." The emphasis on the last word was unmistakable. The flight continued, but the atmosphere had soured. Reynolds repeatedly pressed his call button for trivial requests, each time seizing the opportunity to make a veiled comment about today's youth or changing demographics. Catherine's prejudice became increasingly blatant. She served drinks without a napkin for Jamal, and then the hot towels ran out just before she reached him. Each incident was small, seemingly insignificant on its own, but together they formed a barrage of subtle insults. The final blow came during meal service. As Catherine leaned over to place Reynolds' meal tray, she accidentally knocked over Jamal's apple juice, sending it cascading onto his lap and his expensive suit. "Oh my," she said, her voice lacking any real concern. "Accidents happen." She offered a single cocktail napkin, utterly inadequate for the spill, before moving on to the next passenger, leaving Jamal soaked and humiliated. In the cramped airplane bathroom, Jamal fought back tears. He dabbed at the stain with damp paper towels, but the damage was already done. The suit, a symbol of his father's pride and his own aspirations, was ruined. For a moment, he allowed himself a flicker of vulnerability. When he returned to his seat, red-eyed but composed, Linda had replaced his juice and placed extra napkins on his tray. "I'm sorry about what happened," she whispered, her eyes conveying what she couldn't say aloud. Jamal nodded gratefully. A businesswoman seated a few rows behind, a Latina in her 40s with kind eyes, stopped by his seat. She slipped him a business card. "Don't let them break you," she whispered. "Angela Ramirez, civil rights attorney." As the flight progressed, Catherine's comments became even more pointed, more public. "That's quite a fancy suit for someone so young," she remarked loudly, hovering near his seat. "I wonder how you could afford something like that." The insinuation was clear, and it cut deeper than the spilled juice. The Skyline Airlines flight from Atlanta to New York had reached cruising altitude, but for Jamal Washington, the journey had become increasingly turbulent. Trying to focus on his business presentation notes, he found it impossible to concentrate as Catherine Brady's hostility created an atmosphere of tension around him. identifying patterns of discriminatory behavior and systemic failures. What I realized, he continued, is that equal space needs to be more than a business resource. It needs to be a platform for accountability. With that, he unveiled the expanded vision for his app, a system that would allow users to document and report discrimination in real time, creating data patterns that could drive meaningful change in service industries. The technical framework was already in place. He had stayed up most of the night coding the additional features. Discrimination thrives in silence. Jamal concluded, his young voice carrying surprising authority. Equal identifying patterns of discriminatory behavior and systemic failures. What I realized, he continued, is that equal space needs to be more than a business resource. It needs to be a platform for accountability. With that, he unveiled the expanded vision for his app, a system that would allow users to document and report discrimination in real time, creating data patterns that could drive meaningful change in service industries. The technical framework was already in place. He had stayed up most of the night coding the additional features. Discrimination thrives in silence. Jamal concluded, his young voice carrying surprising authority. Equal space will ensure that these experiences are documented, validated, and addressed not just for those with connections or resources, but for everyone who faces unfair treatment based on who they are. As he finished, the convention hall remained silent for a long moment before erupting in applause. The judges leaned forward, suddenly engaged in a way they hadn't been for previous presentations. Mr. Washington, the venture capitalist, began, "This is remarkably sophisticated work for someone your age. How did you develop the pattern recognition algorithms?" For the next 15 minutes, Jamal fielded increasingly complex technical questions, demonstrating not just vision, but extraordinary technical expertise. By the time he returned to his booth, a crowd had gathered, interested investors and fellow young entrepreneurs eager to learn more. Among them was James Chen, a 17-year-old tech prodigy whose family owned a major software company. "That was impressive," James said, extending his hand. "Most people here are building toys. You're building something necessary." Throughout the afternoon, Jamal's booth became one of the most visited at the conference. The same peers who had dismissed him earlier now approached with respect, if not outright admiration. Several investors expressed interest in providing seed funding, impressed by both the concept and Jamal's obvious technical prowess. When the judges returned for the final evaluation, the tension in the exhibition hall was palpable. The announcements began with honorable mentions, followed by category winners for sustainability, healthcare innovation, and educational technology. And now announced Dr. Maya Patel, the academic judge, our overall winner, who will receive $50,000 in seed funding and mentorship from Innovate Capital. She paused, building anticipation as she opened the envelope. The winner of this year's Young Innovators Conference is Jamal Washington for Equal Space. The applause was thunderous as Jamal made his way back to the stage, acceptance speech in hand. But before he could begin, his phone buzzed with a notification. Glancing down, he saw a news alert. Tech prodigy's discrimination claim goes viral. Respect Jamal trending nationwide. Confused, Jamal opened the link to find a social media explosion around his experience. Someone he suspected, Linda Chen, had shared his story online, including partial recordings from the flight. The Respect Jamal was trending with thousands, sharing their own experiences of discrimination in the service industry. As he delivered his acceptance speech, Jamal was acutely aware that his audience had suddenly expanded far beyond the convention center. His words about accountability and documentation resonated not just with the conference attendees, but with countless others following the unfolding story online. Stepping off the stage, Jamal was immediately surrounded by journalists eager for interviews. Among them was a reporter from Tech Innovator magazine, whose questions went beyond the viral story to focus on the technical merits of his app. "Your pattern recognition algorithm is remarkably sophisticated," the journalist noted. "How did you develop it at such a young age?" "My father taught me coding when I was 8, Jamal explained. "I've been building on those skills ever since." "And your father is an entrepreneur," Jamal replied simply, maintaining his father's privacy. As the crowd of reporters grew, Vanessa stepped in gently, extracting her nephew. "That's enough questions for today. Jamal needs to rest." Back in their hotel suite, Jamal's phone continued to buzz with notifications. Among them was a message from Linda Chen. I couldn't stay silent. What happened was wrong. I've provided a statement to the airline and on social media. I'm sorry if this complicates things for you, but it needed to be said. Another message came from Angela Ramirez. You've started something important. When you're ready to discuss next steps, call me. Most surprising was an email from James Chen's father, Victor Chen, CEO of Chen Technologies. Your innovation and courage are remarkable. Chen Technologies would be interested in discussing partnership opportunities for equal space. My son speaks very highly of you. As Jamal processed the day's unexpected developments, his hotel room door opened. Standing there still in his travel clothes and clearly exhausted from a transatlantic flight was Elijah Washington. "Dad!" Jamal exclaimed, rushing into his father's embrace. Elijah held his son tightly, his usual composed demeanor giving way to raw emotion. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there," he whispered. "It's okay, Dad," Jamal replied. I think what happened needed to happen." Elijah pulled back, studying his son's face with a mixture of concern and pride. "Vanessa told me, you won the conference and now you're trending online." Jamal nodded, explaining how his experience had transformed his app's purpose and sparked a larger conversation about discrimination. Elijah listened intently, his expression shifting from concern to thoughtful consideration. "So, what do you want to do next?" he finally asked. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," Jamal replied without hesitation. "Not just on Skyline Airlines, but anywhere." A slow smile spread across Elijah's face, the same expression he wore when closing an important deal. "Then let's make that happen." As father and son began strategizing, neither could have predicted how the next 24 hours would unfold or how a single flight attendant's discriminatory actions would ultimately transform an entire industry. The morning after Jamal's conference triumph, the Washington Hotel suite transformed into an impromptu command center. Elijah Washington, still jet-lagged but laser-focused, worked 3 phones simultaneously while Vanessa managed the flood of media requests. Jamal sat cross-legged on the sofa monitoring social media, where the End Respect Jamal and Darbar Boycott Skyline continued to trend worldwide. "Skyline Airlines has issued a statement," Vanessa announced, reading from her tablet. "They say they're investigating the alleged incident and take all customer concerns seriously, then the usual boilerplate about diversity being a core value." Elijah's expression hardened. Alleged incident. He repeated the word sharp with contempt as if there weren't recordings and multiple witnesses. The dismissive corporate response had come after Jamal's story exploded online overnight. Linda Chen's social media posts, which included her own account of Catherine Brady's behavior and corroborated Jamal's experience, had gone viral, amplified by Angela Ramirez, who had shared a legal perspective on the discrimination witnessed. Elijah's phone rang again. Thomas Gregory, CEO of Skyline Airlines, attempting his 3rd call of the morning. For the 3rd time, Elijah declined it. "Shouldn't you talk to him?" Jamal asked, looking up from his laptop. "Not yet," Elijah replied, checking his watch. "The board meeting isn't for another hour. Let him sweat." What Skyline Airlines didn't know, what very few people knew, was that Washington Enterprises had been quietly acquiring shares in the airline over the past 6 months, preparing for a possible expansion into the travel technology sector. Elijah now held enough stock to command a seat at the emergency board meeting called to address the PR crisis. "Angela Ramirez is here," Vanessa announced, answering a knock at the door. The civil rights attorney entered professional in a charcoal suit carrying a leather portfolio. "Mr. Washington?" She greeted Elijah with a firm handshake before turning to Jamal with a warm smile. "And the man of the hour. Congratulations on your conference win." "Thank you for everything you've done," Jamal replied, genuinely grateful for her support. "I've just come from a meeting with 3 other passengers from your flight who've agreed to provide statements." Angela reported pulling documents from her portfolio, and Linda Chen has officially filed an internal complaint about Catherine Brady's history of discriminatory behavior toward minority passengers. Elijah nodded approvingly. This isn't just about what happened to Jamal. It's about a pattern of behavior Skyline has apparently been willing to ignore. "Exactly," Angela agreed. "And I found 5 similar complaints filed against Miss Brady in the past year alone, all quietly resolved with vouchers and non-disclosure agreements." Vanessa, who had been scanning news reports, looked up sharply. There's more. Benjamin Reynolds, the passenger who was encouraging Catherine, is the brother-in-law of Skyline board member Richard Anderson. The revelation added another dimension to the incident. Not only had Jamal faced discrimination from a flight attendant with a history of similar behavior, but he'd been targeted with the implicit support of someone connected to Skyline's leadership. Elijah checked his watch again. It's time, Jamal. Are you sure you want to come? No one would think less of you if you sat this out. Jamal straightened his tie. Another perfectly tailored suit. This one a deep charcoal gray. I need to be there, Dad. This is my fight, too. The Skyline Airlines headquarters occupied the top floors of a gleaming midtown skyscraper. The security guards, clearly briefed about their arrival, escorted them directly to the executive floor, where a palpable tension permeated the air. Thomas Gregory, Skyline CEO, a silver-haired man with the weathered tan of someone who spent more time on golf courses than in boardrooms, greeted them with forced cordiality. Elijah, I can't tell you how deeply concerned we are about this unfortunate misunderstanding. He began extending his hand. Elijah regarded the offered hand with cool assessment before eventually shaking it. Let's be clear, Thomas. What happened to my son wasn't a misunderstanding. It was discrimination witnessed and documented by multiple passengers. Gregory's smile faltered. Of course, we take these allegations very seriously. They're not allegations. Jamal interrupted, his young voice steady. They happened. I have recordings. Gregory looked taken back, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged by a 12-year-old. Well, I'm sure once we've completed our internal review, I believe that review might need to happen more publicly than you'd prefer, Angela interjected smoothly. Given the pattern of similar incidents that have been systematically buried, the CEO's composure slipped further. I'm not sure who you are, Mess Ramirez, civil rights attorney. I was on the flight with Jamal. But before Gregory could respond, his assistant appeared at his elbow, whispering urgently. His face powled as he listened. Skyline stock has dropped 15% since market opening, Elijah observed casually, checking his phone. That's what happens when our boycott Skyline trends worldwide and celebrities start canceling their corporate accounts. Gregory's jaw tightened. The board is waiting. Shall we? The boardroom fell silent as they entered. 12 board members sat around a massive table, their expressions ranging from concern to outright hostility. Richard Anderson, Benjamin Reynolds' brother-in-law, glared openly at Jamal. At the far end of the table, looking distinctly uncomfortable, sat Catherine Brady. She froze when she spotted Jamal, the color draining from her face as she realized who he was, and more importantly, who his father was. Mrs. S. Brady, I believe you've already met my son on yesterday's flight, Elijah stated, his voice cutting through the tension like ice. Let's discuss how you treated him, shall we? For the next hour, the boardroom became a courtroom of sorts. Angela presented the documented pattern of discrimination, including statements from other passengers and previous complaints against Catherine. Jamal played selected recordings from the flight, his young voice steady as he narrated the context for each clip. Catherine's defense crumbled as the evidence mounted. Her claims of a misunderstanding rang hollow against the recorded evidence of her asking to verify Jamal's ticket 4 separate times. Her comments about his fancy suit and the accidental drink spill, followed by inadequate assistance. Ms. Brady has been with Skyline for 15 years. Gregory attempted desperation creeping into his voice. Her record has been exemplary. Except for the 6 formal complaints of discriminatory behavior, all settled quietly, Angela countered, sliding copies of the documentation across the table, and Ms. Chen's testimony about being instructed to ignore similar incidents in the past. At that moment, the boardroom door opened and Linda Chin entered, escorted by Vanessa. Her presence clearly surprised the Skyline executives. Ms. Chen is still employed by Skyline despite attempts to silence her, Vanessa explained, taking a seat beside Jamal. She's here voluntarily to provide additional context. Linda's testimony proved devastating. In a clear professional voice, she detailed not just Catherine's treatment of Jamal, but a pattern of similar behavior toward minority passengers that had been repeatedly reported and systematically ignored by management. We were told that keeping our premium customers comfortable was the priority, Linda explained, and it was implied that this meant catering to the preferences of older white passengers, even when those preferences were discriminatory. As the evidence mounted, the board members' expressions shifted from defensive to concerned. The potential legal and public relations implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Richard Anderson, however, remained defiant. "This is clearly an orchestrated attack," he declared. "Washington, you've been buying Skyline stock for months. This is about corporate takeover, not some perceived slight to your son." Elijah's expression remained impassive. "My interest in Skyline began as a business opportunity." "That's true. But this incident has revealed something far more concerning than your balance sheet. It's exposed a culture that tolerates discrimination at every level. From flight attendants to board members whose relatives feel comfortable making racist comments to children." Anderson flushed crimson. "My brother-in-law would never." "I have the recordings," Mr. Anderson. Jamal interrupted quietly. "Every comment Mr. Reynolds made about standard slipping and questioning my right to be in first class is documented." The boardroom fell silent as the full implications sank in. Skyline wasn't facing just one incident, but evidence of systemic discrimination that could potentially violate federal laws. Thomas Gregory, sensing the shifting tide, attempted damage control. "Clearly, mistakes were made. We're prepared to offer compensation in a formal apology." "This isn't about compensation," Elijah cut in. "It's about transformation. Skyline has a choice to make: address the root causes of these incidents or face legal and financial consequences that will make today's stock drop look like a minor correction." He laid out his terms: comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all staff and independent review of past complaints, a diverse oversight committee with actual authority and immediate implementation of new reporting systems, ironically similar to what Jamal's app was designed to provide. As the board members huddled in hasty discussion, Catherine Brady finally spoke, her voice thick with tears. "I want to apologize to Jamal." "I never meant to stop," Jamal said, meeting her gaze directly. "You meant every word, every action. You judged me the moment you saw me. You decided I didn't belong in first class because of how I look. That wasn't a mistake. It was a choice." Catherine fell silent, unable to maintain eye contact with the 12-year-old, whose dignity now stood in stark contrast to her own crumbling composure. Thomas Gregory cleared his throat. "We'll need time to consider these proposals." "You have 24 hours, Elijah replied, rising to his feet. "After that, Ms. Ramirez files her class action lawsuit, and I call for a shareholder vote to replace the board." As they exited the boardroom, leaving behind a panel of stunned executives, Jamal felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also a profound sense of responsibility. What had begun as a personal humiliation was evolving into something much larger, with potential implications for countless others who face similar discrimination without the resources or connections to fight back. "Did we just threaten to take over an airline?" he asked his father as they entered the elevator. Elijah's serious expression gave way to a rare smile. "Sometimes, son, the most effective way to change a system is from within." The elevator doors closed on the Skyline boardroom, where the future of an airline and perhaps an industry hung in the balance. 1 week after the boardroom showdown, Jamal Washington found himself once again in Skyline Airlines headquarters. The tension in the executive conference room was palpable as Thomas Gregory shuffled papers, nervously avoiding eye contact with the assembled group. To Jamal's left sat his father, Elijah Washington, poised and commanding in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. To his right, Angela Ramirez reviewed legal documents with practiced efficiency. Linda Chen sat nearby, her normally warm expression replaced by professional determination. The Washington family's team was completed by Aunt Vanessa, who had taken a week's leave from her own executive position to support her nephew through this process. Across the table, Skyline's contingent presented a stark contrast in their unified discomfort. Thomas Gregory occupied the center position, flanked by the airline's legal counsel and HR director. Richard Anderson, Benjamin Reynolds' brother-in-law, had been conspicuously excluded from this meeting. A small victory Jamal had quietly celebrated. At the far end of the table, separated slightly from her colleagues, Catherine Brady sat with her hands clasped tightly before her. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back severely, complexion pallid under harsh fluorescent lighting. "Thank you all for coming," Gregory began his practiced corporate voice, betraying a slight tremor. "We've reviewed the situation thoroughly and believe there's been a misunderstanding that we are eager to resolve amicably." Elijah raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, allowing the CEO to continue digging his own grave. "Ms. Brady has been with Skyline for 15 years, with an exemplary service record," Gregory continued. "While there may have been a lapse in judgment during this particular interaction, we believe—" "Excuse me," Jamal interrupted, his young voice steady, "but there was no misunderstanding." All eyes turned to the 12-year-old surprise evident on the Skyline executives' faces. They clearly hadn't expected him to speak. "With all due respect," Mr. Gregory Jamal continued, "what happened on that flight wasn't a misunderstanding or a lapse in judgment. It was discrimination, plain and simple." Gregory's smile tightened. "Young man, in the adult business world, I believe my son has earned the right to speak," Elijah interjected smoothly, "particularly since he's the one who experienced Miss Brady's behavior firsthand." Jamal nodded gratefully to his father before continuing. "I'd like to present my evidence systematically if that's acceptable." Without waiting for permission, Jamal opened his laptop and connected it to the conference room's display system. With methodical precision that belied his age, he began presenting a timeline of the flight supported by recordings, photographs, and contemporaneous notes. "At 1:42 p.m., Ms. Brady checked my boarding pass for the first time," he narrated, displaying the time-stamped evidence. "At 1:55 p.m., she checked it again. At 2:10 p.m. for a third time, and at 2:47 p.m. for a fourth time. No other passenger had their ticket verified more than once." He continued through each interaction methodically. The accidental drink spilled the comments about his fancy suit, the suggestions about his luggage being borrowed, and the consistent pattern of service discrepancies between his treatment and that of white passengers. Catherine shifted uncomfortably as her actions were laid bare, stripped of plausible deniability by Jamal's meticulous documentation. "This behavior didn't occur in isolation," Angela Ramirez added, taking over smoothly. "Our investigation has uncovered 17 similar complaints against Ms. Brady over the past 3 years, all involving passengers of color, all resolved quietly with vouchers and confidentiality agreements." Thomas Gregory's face pad. "Those complaints were handled according to company policy. A policy designed to bury systemic discrimination rather than address it," Angela countered, sliding a thick folder across the table. "This constitutes a pattern of negligence that could potentially violate federal anti-discrimination laws." The Skyline legal counsel whispered urgently to Gregory, whose expression grew increasingly grim. Linda Chin cleared her throat. "If I may add to this evidence," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "Ms. Brady's behavior toward minority passengers has been an open secret among the flight crew for years. Multiple flight attendants have reported concerns to management, myself included." She produced her own documentation, copies of emails, dates of verbal reports, and names of supervisors who had dismissed these concerns. 3 months ago, I formally reported an incident where Miss Brady made derogatory comments about a Middle Eastern family and provided substandard service." Linda continued, "I was told by my supervisor that some passengers prefer traditional American service and that I should focus on maintaining harmony in the cabin." Catherine Brady, who had remained silent throughout these presentations, finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I never intended to discriminate against anyone. I was simply maintaining the standards our premium passengers expect." "And what standards are those?" Miss Brady Jamal asked, his voice calm but pointed. "Because from where I sat, those standards seemed to include automatically suspecting black passengers of being in the wrong seat regardless of their ticket." Catherine flushed. "That's not fair. You were very young to be traveling alone in first class. It was unusual. Yet the white teenager in 5C wasn't questioned once Jamal noted displaying a photograph. He was also traveling alone, also a minor. The difference was his skin color." Catherine fell silent, unable to counter this point. Thomas Gregory attempted to regain control of the meeting. "While we take these concerns seriously, this appears to be one employee's actions rather than a systemic issue. 23 complaints across 16 different Skyline routes, all following the same pattern. Angela interrupted, producing another document, all handled with the same confidentiality agreements, all buried rather than addressed. She laid out additional evidence, internal emails showing Skyline managers discussing how to quietly resolve discrimination complaints without unnecessary escalation, training materials that emphasize catering to the comfort level of our premium demographic, and performance metrics that rewarded flight attendants for maintaining traditional service standards. As the evidence mounted, the Skyline executives' defenses crumbled visibly. What they had hoped to frame as an isolated incident had been revealed as part of a broader pattern that extended beyond Catherine Brady to the corporate culture itself. Unexpectedly, the conference room door opened and 3 more former Skyline passengers entered. An older black businessman, a young Hispanic woman, and a Middle Eastern man in his 30s. These individuals experienced similar treatment on Skyline flights, Vanessa explained. They've agreed to join MS Ramirez's class action if necessary. Thomas Gregory's composure finally broke. "What exactly do you want from us?" he demanded, desperation evident in his voice. "Financial compensation, public apology, transformation," Elijah replied simply. "Skyline has a cancer in its corporate culture. Removing Ms. Brady would be like treating a symptom while ignoring the disease." He laid out their demands: a comprehensive overhaul of Skyline's training, reporting, and accountability systems, an independent diversity committee with actual authority, transparent handling of all discrimination complaints, and implementation of technology to identify and address patterns of discriminatory behavior. Catherine Brady, watching her career implode in real time, made one last attempt at damage control. "I want to apologize to Jamal," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I never meant to hurt you. I was just doing my job the way I was trained to do it." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Jamal. The 12-year-old regarded Catherine thoughtfully, wisdom beyond his years evident in his measured response. "Miss Brady, I appreciate that you believe that. But your apology doesn't change what happened. Not just to me, but to countless others who didn't have the resources to fight back. What matters now isn't your words, but your actions, and Skyline's commitment to ensure this never happens again." Catherine nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Thomas Gregory, recognizing the inevitable, cleared his throat. "We'll need time to consider these proposals." "You've had a week," Elijah countered. "Your stock has dropped 23%. 3 major corporate accounts have suspended their contracts pending resolution. The court of public opinion has already rendered its verdict. The only question is whether Skyline will be part of the solution or continue to be the problem." As the meeting concluded, Jamal gathered his materials with the same methodical precision he'd shown throughout the presentation. He felt no triumph, no vindication, only a sobering awareness of how much work remained to be done. Outside the conference room, Linda Chin approached him. "You handled that with remarkable maturity," she said. "Most adults wouldn't have shown such composure." Jamal smiled slightly. "My dad always says dignity is the most powerful response to discrimination." Linda nodded. "I've submitted my resignation from Skyline effective immediately. I can't be part of a system that enables this behavior." "What will you do now?" Jamal asked. "I've received several offers." "Actually," Linda replied, "including one from your father to help develop training programs for service industry professionals. But I wanted to ask your opinion before accepting." Jamal's eyes widened in surprise. "My opinion? You've earned that right," Linda said simply. "Your experience is driving this change. Your voice should be part of shaping what comes next." As they walked toward the elevator, Jamal considered how much had changed in just over a week. What had begun as a humiliating personal experience had catalyzed a movement that could potentially transform not just one airline, but an entire industry's approach to discrimination. The real work, he realized, was just beginning. 6 months later, Jamal Washington stepped through the sliding glass doors of Skyline Airlines headquarters, no longer as an accuser, but as a consultant. At 13, having celebrated his birthday the previous month, he carried himself with the confidence of someone much older, dressed in a tailored navy suit that mirrored his father's executive attire. The lobby had transformed since his last visit, where corporate sterility had once dominated vibrant artwork from diverse artists now adorn the walls. The security guard, a middle-aged black woman with a warm smile, greeted him by name. "Good morning, Mr. Washington. The board is expecting you on the 12th floor." As Jamal rode the elevator upward, he reflected on the whirlwind 6 months that had followed the confrontation with Skyline leadership. The airline had ultimately accepted all of the Washington's demands, recognizing that the alternative, a class action lawsuit and continued public relations nightmare, would be far more costly. Catherine Brady was no longer employed by Skyline or any other airline. Rather than being simply terminated, she had been required to complete extensive sensitivity training and community service with organizations serving minority communities. Last, Jamal had heard she was working with a nonprofit focused on educational equity, a fitting redirection of her career. The elevator doors opened to reveal a transformed executive floor. Framed photographs showcasing Skyline's diverse workforce had replaced the sterile corporate art. A large mission statement dominated the reception area, prominently featuring the words, "Deegan, Respect, and Inclusion." Thomas Gregory, still Skyline's CEO, though now flanked by a more diverse executive team, rose to greet Jamal. The past months had aged him visibly, stress etching new lines around his eyes, but his handshake was firm and his smile genuine. "Jamal, thank you for coming. The team is eager to hear your assessment of our progress." The boardroom where the confrontation had occurred 6 months earlier was now filled with new faces. Richard Anderson was conspicuously absent, having resigned to pursue other opportunities shortly after the scandal broke. Benjamin Reynolds, his brother-in-law, who had encouraged Catherine's discrimination, had been banned from Skyline flights permanently. Linda Chen, now Skyline's Director of Inclusive Service Training, greeted Jamal with a warm embrace. Her promotion had been part of the company's overhaul, a recognition of her courage in speaking out and her expertise in customer service. "Your father sent his regrets," Linda told him. The London meeting couldn't be rescheduled. Jamal nodded, secretly pleased. While Elijah had been instrumental in forcing Skyline's transformation, today's presentation was Jamal's alone, a testament to his father's confidence in him. Before we begin, Thomas Gregory announced, "I want to acknowledge how far we've come since Jamal first brought these issues to our attention. What began as a painful incident has transformed Skyline in ways we couldn't have imagined. The statistical evidence supported this claim. Discrimination complaints had decreased by 78%. Employee satisfaction scores among minority staff had increased dramatically. Most tellingly, Skyline's customer satisfaction ratings had improved across all demographics." Now, Gregory continued, "I'd like Jamal to share his assessment of our diversity and inclusion implementation." At 13, Jamal Washington was possibly the youngest consultant ever to address a major airlines board. Yet, as he connected his laptop to the display system and launched his presentation, his youth seemed irrelevant. The data he had compiled, the analysis he had conducted, and the recommendations he presented reflected a sophistication that commanded respect regardless of age. "Skyline has made significant progress," Jamal began, "but sustainable transformation requires ongoing commitment. Today I want to discuss 3 areas where improvement is still needed." For the next 45 minutes, he detailed his findings. Areas where implementation was lagging, departments where resistance to change remained, and opportunities for deeper integration of inclusive practices. His presentation was neither accusatory nor congratulatory, but analytical and solution-focused. When he finished, the board members didn't patronize him with simplified questions or condescending praise. Instead, they engaged with his analysis, directly debating implementation strategies and resource allocation with the seriousness his work deserved. "We've also rolled out your Equal Space app across our customer service platforms," Gregory noted. "The ability for passengers to report and rate their experiences in real time has been revolutionary." Jamal nodded. What had begun as his conference project had evolved into a powerful tool for accountability, now being adopted by service industries beyond aviation. The app's success had attracted significant investment, with proceeds establishing a foundation to support minority youth interested in technology and aviation. After the board meeting, Jamal was escorted to a training session for new flight attendants. As he entered the training room, 30 faces turned toward him with expressions of recognition. His story had become part of Skyline's onboarding process, not as a cautionary tale, but as a foundational case study in the importance of equitable service. Mr. Washington will be observing today's session, Linda announced to the trainees. As many of you know, his experience helped Skyline recognize and address systemic issues in our service model. From the back of the room, Jamal watched as Linda led the trainees through scenarios designed to identify and counter unconscious bias. The exercises were sophisticated, the discussions nuanced, and the commitment evident. During a break, a young black woman approached him. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said quietly. "I've worked in customer service for years, always feeling like I had to accept certain realities. What you did changed things for all of us." Later that afternoon, as Jamal prepared to depart, Thomas Gregory walked him to the elevator. "Your father mentioned you'll be flying Skyline to Chicago next week for the Youth Innovation Summit." Jamal nodded. "First solo flight since, well, you know." Gregory's expression turned serious. "I want to personally assure you that the experience will be nothing like last time." "I know," Jamal replied simply. The following week, as Jamal boarded his Skyline flight to Chicago, he was greeted with genuine respect by the entire crew. The flight attendant, who helped him with his carry-on, was professional and courteous, treating him with the same dignity afforded to every first-class passenger. As the plane took off, Jamal gazed out the window, reflecting on how a single discriminatory incident had sparked a transformation that extended far beyond one airline. His Equal Space app was now being implemented across multiple service industries, creating accountability and driving systemic change. The Washington Foundation had established scholarships for minority youth interested in aviation and technology, ensuring the next generation would find more open doors than closed ones. Most importantly, Jamal himself had grown from the experience. The 12-year-old, who had been humiliated for wearing a suit that was too fancy, had emerged stronger, more determined, and even more committed to creating a world where people were judged by their character rather than their color. As the flight attendant offered him apple juice served with a napkin and a genuine smile, Jamal accepted with quiet confidence. Sometimes, he reflected, transformation begins with a single moment of injustice, challenged by those brave enough to stand up and say, "This is wrong and it needs to change." Jamal's story teaches us that confronting discrimination requires both courage and strategy. When faced with injustice, documenting the evidence-building alliances with witnesses and approaching the problem systematically can transform personal pain into powerful change. The most effective response to discrimination isn't just righteous anger, though that has its place, but thoughtful action that exposes patterns and demands accountability. True transformation happens when we move beyond individual incidents to address the systems that enable them. Catherine Brady wasn't just one prejudiced flight attendant. She was a symptom of a corporate culture that tacitly permitted discrimination. By targeting the root causes rather than just the symptoms, Jamal and his father created lasting change that benefited countless others. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that dignity is the most powerful response to discrimination. Throughout his ordeal, Jamal maintained his composure and self-respect, refusing to let others' prejudice define his worth. His greatest victory wasn't in punishing those who wronged him, but in creating systems that prevented others from experiencing the same injustice. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination in a public place? How did you respond? Share your story in the comments below. If you believe that standing up against racism requires both courage and strategy, hit that like button to show your support. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about overcoming discrimination and creating positive change. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, share this video with them today. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most powerful force for change is a single voice brave enough to speak truth to.